Welcome everyone to Science on Tap. Appreciate you coming out on this cold, blustery night. Science on Tap is a community education program where we bring curiosity in the community together to have conversations. We do this once a month, and very grateful for our partnership with Radio Artifact and Urban Artifact, and thank you all for being here. I don't believe in long intros, so I'm going to turn it right over to James Mack. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to talk to you about something I'm passionate about, and hopefully when I'm done, you'll be passionate about it too. I also say I had a conversation with Jen about doing this, and I think it was in October or so, and I said, oh, well, I probably can't do it in October. So we picked a date, and it was November 6th was going to be the date. And she said, well, that's the day after the election. You sure you want to do it that day? I said, well, you're probably right. So that's how we got to December. That's how December 4th came through. So I'm going to talk to you about mechanochemistry. Don't worry, it's going to be very light on the chemistry. So if you're not really into chemistry, you don't have to worry about that part of it. But really want to talk about the impact that it can make and the impact of green chemistry and all the things there. In order to do that, one of the things that I want to really talk about is the impact that science has beyond the discipline. So I'm a chemist by training, spent a lot of years studying chemistry, and I work in a laboratory and so on and so forth, and that's what I do. But the things that we do have an impact that affect everyone's lives in a lot of different ways. And so this impact is a responsibility that scientists all bear the brunt of. Unfortunately, it's not always taught that way, and so one of the things that I try to do with the students that I engage with is teach them about you're not just doing chemistry, but you are actively a member of society, and the things that you do has a very impactful impact on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it's not just science for science sake. With that being said, a lot of the conversations I have is about chemistry, but it's also about culture. And so the questions that I ask is chemistry a thing, meaning that bonds are made, bonds are broken, there's a lot of things that are being generated that you all use, but the chemist, the person, has a culture of how they operate. And very rarely in science do we talk about that culture. We talk about the person, the people, and things of that sort. And so hopefully one of the things that you'll see is culture will eat strategy. So you can have a lot of strategy. And I'll tell you a lot of strategies we have and so on and so forth. But I also give you some of the cultural aspects of some of the things that we need to do as well in science to make it real. The other thing that I'm going to tell you about a little bit is change management. And so, you know, if we're going to make progress, that means changes are going to have to happen. That means people are going to have to stop doing the things they used to do and start doing some new things. And that always comes along with some challenges, so I'm going to tell you about that too. So even if it kind of makes sense, and hopefully you'll see scientifically goes, oh, that seems reasonable. How come we just don't do that? Well, there's a cultural aspect that comes along with it that doesn't make things easy. So when I used to talk about mechanochemistry, and I haven't told you what it is, and you will learn about it a little bit later, I used to always talk about how different it is from the way people used to do things. And people will always be like, I don't want to do that, I want to do that. So I started thinking about and listening to Adam Grant about, well, tell people how it's similar to the way they do things, and then they're more adaptable to change it. And so I'll talk about some of the ways that it is different, but also some of the ways that it's the same as what we do. Before I do any of that, I'm going to start the journey in roughly 1957 or so with fire ants. Now, you might think about, what does fire ants have anything to do with mechanochemistry or green chemistry or chemistry in general? But the South American fire ant was a really, really big problem in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And it still is, fire ants still is a problem today, but it's mostly rooted in the South. So all those states down below, because that's where crops were and so on and so forth. And so the United States Department of Agriculture needed to figure out what to do with fire ants, and so people were really up in arms about fire ants. So much up in arms that they had propaganda about the fire ants. And so I'm going to show you snippets of a video. It's about 5 or 6 minutes or so. So you won't hear me for a while, just to hear what your government, the United States Department of Agriculture, needed to do about fire ants. So hopefully.
In the long and fascinating history of life on Earth, human beings have lived with and have battled insects for many centuries. Now the war is between man and the imported fire ant. Since the fire ant is on trial, please listen to his defense.
2,000 years ago, the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder wrote that in India there were giant ants the color of cats and as large as Egyptian wolves that mined gold. As an ant, I can tell you that this is nonsense. We never grew that big. We didn't have to. Instead, we grew to be many. And we've always found man's valuable crops far more appetizing than his gold. But only recently has man bothered with my particular species. We are known as imported fire ants, so called to distinguish us from fire ants native to this country. A few years ago, scientists looked us over, gave us a Latin name I can't even pronounce, and declared that we were a serious pest. In a few laboratories, like this one in Gulfport, Mississippi, my relatives are captured for study. Maybe we are serious pests. I don't know. Being an ant, I'm prejudiced. But before you people join in the fight against fire ants, I'd like you to have the facts. This film will help you to know us better, help you to take a close look at the problem, to see what human communities are doing and how full-grown men are trying to control us tiny creatures.
I've seen damage done to other crops, too, like potatoes, corn, clover, small grains, beans, and peanuts. As a farmer here in the South, I can tell you from experience, these ants are vicious when they're disturbed. They fight anything, anybody. What's more, in most cases, little beggars win. In heavily infested areas, they make it hard for farmers like me to hire field hands. In addition to people, the ants attack animals. Newborn lambs, pigs, and calves are victims of the fire ants' terrible appetite.
Don't think the pest just limits itself to wildlife and agriculture. Construction gangs and utility crews have tried various ways to avoid them. Trouble is, fire ants can't read.
Now, don't get the idea that our homes are safe from attack by the fire ant. Mommy! Betty! Mommy! I'll tell you something else. Cemeteries are favorite places for these pesky things. I know people who've suffered painful stings while attending burial services where there were fire ant mounds. My husband is always ranting about how fire ants cause a lot of trouble on the golf course. An unnatural hazard, they call it.
Areas are broken into smaller units for installment treatment. Thus, only a manageable portion of the total acreage is treated at a time. According to this plan, in several years, our eradication program can be completed. Already, reports show good results in our fight against the fire ant.
This is your TV farm reporter bringing you the latest in the fire ant eradication program. In the areas treated to date, officials and farmers report excellent kills of fire ants. In the treatment, every precaution is taken to protect wildlife, fish, and birds. Since the dry insecticide pours like sugar, it does not stick to dry vegetation and will not be eaten by animals and birds feeding in foliage, berries, and fruits. Instead, it reaches the ground where it can destroy fire ants.
All right. It's been brought out in this meeting that we have at least 3 primary objectives in our fight against the fire ant. First, we want to prevent further spread of this pest. And secondly, we must locate and eradicate these outlying infestations. And finally, we want to develop county or area-wide eradication programs in these generally infested areas.
Well, what can we as individuals do?
I'm glad you asked that question, because the help of both rural and urban people is needed if we really want to get rid of this pest. Now, here are some of the things that all of you can do. First, participate in community action, such as you have in attending meetings like this, and you will help wipe out this pest. Secondly, give survey and eradication workers free access to your property. Follow all the recommended precautions when insecticides are applied. Report infestations which you suspect are fire ants to your county agent or state entomologist. It will take a long, hard fight to rout this costly and troublesome pest from all its holdings in the South. Just as we have cleansed the nation of other insects, the imported fire ant can be eliminated. Such a campaign is much more effective and far cheaper than living with the pest.
Well, what is your verdict? Can man win the battle with this pest? Everyone thinks man has inherited the earth, but for how long?
Okay, so clearly, fire ants at that period of time was the biggest danger in the United States of America. And they needed to be eradicated. Now, this is the time period, 1957. We just recently used chemical warfare to win a war. So the idea was the solution to any problem, if you could wipe out a country, clearly you could wipe out fire ants. It was just clear as day. During that period of time, there were other individuals thinking about atomic warfare and saying, what's happening to the waste, as you had the Manhattan Project and so on and so forth, and they was raising awareness about what goes on, and there were other people going, nah, don't worry about it. It helps us, it creates a better nation for us. Look at what we were able to do with chemistry. So we have this fire ant problem in the South, 1957. 1960 is an election, and the election is between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. You want votes. So what do? You endorse things that you want people to know. So you have to pick a side. Am I on the side of pesticide and letting things go because people in the South really, really cared about that? The United States Department of Agriculture cares about it, and it's at that time, multi-million-dollar industry. Or are you on the conservative side in terms of the environment and saying, well, wait a second, there's a lot of people talking about environmental things and so on and so forth. And one of the lead champions of that was someone by the name of Rachel Carson. So she was raising awareness about all of these other things that are going on. Kennedy, growing up in Massachusetts, was a proponent of the environment. was very interested in what Rachel Carson had to say, and so was Jackie Kennedy. And she was rooting for Kennedy to win the election. So they started working together. And so she started doing research about pesticides in the environment while helping Kennedy go through the election cycle. So there was a lot of things going on. During that period of time, though, she became ill, but she didn't want anyone to know that she became ill. She had cancer because she was doing chemotherapy. And she knew that if she let people know that she was ill, people would say, you're using chemotherapy to help you live, but meanwhile, you're bashing chemistry and the environment. So now she had to hide a lot of different things while she was doing research and all these other things as it relates to the environment. So, interesting, in this audience, I think everyone knows who won the election. A lot of people I talk to are like, who's Kennedy? Who's Nixon? I don't think I have that issue with this crowd. So Kennedy wins the election. Rachel Carson becomes an advisor to Kennedy, and she writes a book called Silent Spring. Silent Spring is defined because when she said when spring came around, the birds were no longer chirping because there weren't any birds anymore. And that was because DDT, one of the main pesticides used at the time, weakened the eggshells of eggs. When the birds sat on the egg, instead of nesting and hibernating, it crushed the egg, and so it killed the population of the birds. And so that's why it was called Silent Spring. And it was very, 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 very controversial for a number of different reasons. And so this is a New York Times article in 1962, roughly around the same time when the book came out. First excerpts of the book came out in the New Yorker magazine. I don't know if you can see it. I think you can. I wanted to point out a few things if I can. So here we're talking about a $300 million industry in 1962. That's a significant amount of money. And the language of the New York Times article is important, that I'm going to point out. Has been highly irritated by a quiet woman author. And the key piece was woman author. Because at this time, having a female scientist or ecologist was not really in vogue at the time. And they're going to and she's going to tackle a $300 million industry in 1962. So it goes on, and the men who make the pesticides are crying foul. So not only is it a chemistry situation, but it's a woman taking down the men. And that was another big thing that was going on at that time as well. And so it was highly politicized. And so Kennedy created an independent body to investigate all the things that were happening and exonerated Rachel Carson and all the work, and they banned DDT and some of the other pesticides that was going on at the time. And so that was a heroic thing for Kennedy to do. It was the right thing to do, but you can imagine politically that was not something that a lot of people were happy about. So that began the idea of people coming through with chemistry and the environment and how chemistry and human health are connected together. And so we thank Rachel Carson for that. So fast forwarding through the 60s to 1970 is Earth Day, and so you get an opportunity to see what Earth looks like from the moon. And then so people get an idea that the planet actually doesn't look too bad. It's actually a pretty looking piece of rock. And so there's an idea of preserving it in some way, shape, or form. And so people start thinking about the treatment of the planet and how things are happening and so on and so forth. Funny, Nixon creates the Environmental Protection Agency. He gets elected in 68, creates the Environmental Protection Agency. And the idea of the Environmental Protection Agency is to protect the environment. So you basically look at it from conservation to protection is the philosophy of what to do. And so mostly you think about air and water at that time. And so those are the types of things that was called for. This somewhat created a problem, and it's a sort of a problem trying to figure out, okay, what do you ultimately do in these situations? Because if you create standards, so let's say you create a standard for air quality and water, then every industry and most people just meet the standard. So you go up, I create a standard, and I meet the standard. There is no reason to exceed the standard, and so then you never move forward. You never improve. But that was the idea and the philosophy at the time, and I'll tell you about a different philosophy a little bit. So then I'm moved to 1980s in terms of what's going on, and to the Love Canal incident. The Love Canal was built by William T. Love in Niagara, New York. Basically, what he wanted to do was create a canal to have hydropower electric come through. He ran out of money, and so basically there was a huge hole there. The Hooker Chemical Company purchased the hole from William T. Love, and they dumped their chemical waste in the hole. So that's what they decided to do with it. That's how they got rid of their chemical waste. And at that time, it was fine. Okay, so then World War II happens. A lot of other things go through. And so the city of Niagara needed space because they wanted to increase their population of soldiers coming back from war. And so they ran out of room, and so they purchased this hole from the Hooker Chemical Company for $1. And the Hooker Chemical Company provided it to them and said, I want nothing to do with it. And they said, you know, it's yours, do whatever you want with it. So what they decided to do was they lined the bottom with clay, they put dirt in it, and they built a town on top of it. And so they thought the clay barrier would, you know, separate all the chemical waste from it, and then it would be fine. Well, if you are familiar with chemistry or your kitchen chemistry, if I asked you which one floats to the top, oil or water, what would you say? Oil. Oil floats to the top. And so if you have chemical waste, mostly oily stuff at the bottom, it rains, the water goes down, raises the chemicals up, and so now you have a problem. And that was what happened. And so they built homes and everything on it. And then Lois Gibbs was doing some investigating because her son was becoming ill, and she didn't know why. And she learned that her town was built on a toxic waste dump. And so that became an issue, and it made national news, and there was a made-for-TV movie on it, and Lois Gibbs became a celebrity. But that was one of the big things that happened in the 80s and late 70s. The other thing that happened, just another example, Valley of the Drums. A.L. Taylor was right outside of Bullitt County, so it was right outside of Louisville, Kentucky. What he decided to do was he had large farmland, and I could get the waste from a paint company mostly, and so he started to just put it on his land for a profit. At some point, he would dig a hole, put the barrel inside the land, turn it over, and then do it. But it was so profitable for him that he just started putting barrels wherever they were. And so this is a picture that they found on it land. You can imagine it rains, the barrels rust out, and all of the waste falls on the land. And there was a nearby river that runs in, it runs right into the Ohio. So that is how that went through. And so they started looking at a whole lot of other things. The mistake by the lake, if you're from the Cleveland area, there was a company, they was dumping things into the water. There was welding a bridge. A spark from the weld went onto the chemical waste and the oil in the bridge. Again, oil flows to the top, so you light the whole thing on fire, and that was a mistake by the lake. So we had a lot of things happening at around that period of time. And so what happened at that period is we have to do something. So President Carter at the time created something known as the Superfund. The Superfund was a 15-year tax that would go through, so we go from 1980 to 1995, to remediate spaces like the Love Canal and all the other aspects of it. And so the job part is you find a piece of land that's, you know, has some challenges with it, and you remediate it, and then people can live there if you remediate all of it. Okay, so now you have this land, and it had chemical waste on it, but theoretically you fixed it, and so now you can go. Now, so then who's going to live there, right? Because it's still land, and people used to live there before, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine that that land is not really well sought after But you also have federal housing, right? And so they don't really have agency in terms of where they live. So you can see, I think there's a correlation of where federal housing is to the Superfund site. And so then you have some other challenges. So this is in Alabama, where you can see where housing is and where a Superfund site is. And so, of course, you don't tell people that that's where they're living. You just kind of say, this is what it is. And so this is, I think, is outside of Gary, Indiana, in terms of how that happens. So all of these different aspects are going through. So we went from 1950, 60, 70, 80. And so now we're in 1990, and we have to try to figure out some things. And so we switch gears and says, okay, so let's not try to remediate land after it's done. Let's try to fix the problem before it happens. So let's do pollution prevention. So let's prevent the waste before it happens. And so that is what Congress passed. That was during the Bush administration of how we're going to manage that. So when they were trying to do that, they did not want to put limits on it, and they didn't want to put limits on it because then they had the same problem the EPA had, right? So the EPA problem was, if I put a minimum standard on something, then everyone just goes to the minimum. But if I don't put any standard on it, then the law has no teeth to it. So then what do I do? How do I create an environment that gets people and push people to go through? So now we move into 2000. So roughly around that period of time, they're still trying to figure things out. And so one of the things that they took advantage of was the comparative spirit of companies. So if you put standards on something, then people meet the standard, right? So then that's how they go about doing things. But if you recognize good behavior and give people an award, then everyone tries to beat somebody else and be the best they can be because they want the award, and they can say, I got the award and you didn't. And so that's what they decided to do. So they created the Green Chemistry Presidential Award, and they made it the Green Chemistry Challenge. And they had companies go through and say, give me your best ideas. And you can imagine companies gave them their best ideas. And so then they get awards. And so if you're a company, if you're a big company, especially a pharmaceutical company, you have not won the award, of course you're going to be on all of your people. We got to win this award. We got to do something, got to do something, got to do something. And so green chemistry is an idea that when you're doing chemistry, think about the environmental implications that you're doing while you're doing the chemistry instead of the opposite. And so this was an idea that was developed by Paul Anastas and John Warner, and they wrote a theory about it, and there's 12 principles on it. So that's what happened in the United States. In Europe, they created something called REACH. And Europe is a little bit different than the United States. Their environmental restrictions are much higher than the United States. And the reason their environmental restrictions is much higher than the United States is because of land mass. So if you're in the United States, if you look at where waste goes, waste does not go in Washington, D.C. You can imagine why waste doesn't go in Washington, D.C. It also doesn't go in New York. Doesn't go in Massachusetts. Ohio has a significant amount of it. Texas does. You can imagine Idaho, Wyoming, those places. You can imagine if I don't have much agency, no, dump it there. And if I'm in office, I'm not worried about it from that standpoint. So if you do the same principle in Europe, now it's not another state, but another country. So my guess is if you're in England, you just can't throw your waste in France. And if you're in France, I just can't throw it in Germany, and so on and so forth. So now you got a challenge. So now they have to actually have very stringent restrictions on waste and things of that sort. And so their rules are much more stringent. And so they're a little bit further ahead of the game than we are. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about chemistry, not really about the chemistry itself, but just some of the concepts and ideas about what companies decided to do. So this is a synthetic route for Zoloft. And so on the black drawings is what the original pathway was. And so some of these things like this titanium chloride, not a very good thing. You probably don't want to use it. It smokes and stuff like that. You probably don't want to use it. But if you need to do it to make Zoloft, who's going to say, no, I need that. So do whatever you can to do it. And so this was the original route. And so down below, when you start pushing yourself, you start seeing that, hey, do I really need to do that? And the answer was no, I don't really need to do that. And so we can do something different instead. And so they were able to win one of the presidential awards because of the amount of impact that it had on the waste of Zoloft. Here's another situation of looking at solvents. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Solvent is the medium or the liquid that one uses to mix all the things together. So if you think about coffee, if you're a coffee drinker, you have coffee beans and you have sugar, you have whatever else. Water is the vehicle you use to mix it all together. My guess is if you just chewed on some coffee beans and sugar and things of that, so it probably wouldn't be very tasty. But water kind of equals it all out, makes it a lot better. And solvent in chemistry does the exact same thing. And so you probably heard about the term volatile organic compounds. These are the things that evaporates into the air, and then it has air quality issues and so on and so forth. And so they changed their process from things that were heavy as it relates to volatile organic compounds to things that are not so heavy. So this becomes the route. This is ethanol and this is ethyl acetate. To put things in perspective, for those that you all have a beverage, ethanol is the thing that makes you a little woozy. So if you drink enough ethanol, then you stumble over. So you can ingest it, so that's not too bad. And ethyl acetate typically is what you find in fingernail polish remover. And so that becomes something that's much more easily to handle. And so they were able to change their route to do a few things like that. This becomes some of the things that they were able to do. And so they eliminated about 2 million pounds of hazardous materials from the process by the changes they were able to make. And so this was one of the things that if you didn't push somebody to do that, they probably never would. And so you can think about the amount of Zoloft that's created and the amount of that's utilized, that would just go into the environment in some way, and that would cause us some harm. This is another example going through. I'm not going to go through it all the way, but they made similar changes in terms of things. This is another one, sildenafil. If you're not familiar with what that is, you can think about how much of this is created throughout. And so this is the original synthesis. 10 is probably not something good. This thing called oxalochloride is not very good. And so they was able to make some significant changes to this process to change things and make things very, very good. And so this is the commercial process. But again, if you think about the waste produced, a lot of it was solvent waste. And so in the original process, the waste was for every kilogram made, 1,300 liters of solvent was utilized to make that 1 kilogram. They got it down to roughly 22 liters per kilogram. But if you think about tons of Viagra being generated, multiply that number by 22, and that's what we throw out to get there. And so you think about all the things that we take. So I'm on a couple of things. I got, the high blood pressure and this thing and that thing. And, just multiply that number by 22. That's what we threw out in order to make the one pill. And so that's how much is going into the environment. When we do that, a lot of it is solvent waste. These are some other different drugs and different things that are done, and some of the things that people have done to modify things. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we do to help solve this problem at the University of Cincinnati. The research that we're trying to do really focus in on the solvent aspect of it. And the reason why we focus in on the solvent aspect of it goes to what I led with before. So one of the big aspects of green chemistry that people pushed back on is now I have to change the whole way I think about doing chemistry. And I don't wanna change. I gotta learn new reactions. I gotta do this. I've been doing the same thing for a long period of time. I don't want to make that change. And so our idea was that if you can eliminate the solvent piece, now you really don't have to change too much. You do the same thing you were doing before, and you would just do it differently. In terms of maybe use a different vessel or so on and so forth, but most of it would be the same. The other thing is that solvent waste is something that is prevalent all the way through, and so it represents a lot of waste that's generated. And so if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, most of the waste that's generated is solvent waste. So our idea was if you can get rid of that, then you can make a significant impact in the total amount of waste that's generated. So one thing that just passed in 2026, and this is causing my colleagues in chemistry to be up in arms, there's a chemical called methylene chloride that the Biden administration pretty much has banned use of because of its volatile organic compound and some of the challenges it has with the ozone layer and so on and so forth. And so then there's questions of what to do. So full transparency, we're in my research group. This announcement comes out, and one of my students goes through is, we need to buy all of it now. Okay, that is not the approach that we need to take. But it is the approach that that's a knee-jerk reaction that a lot of people is we need to hoard it all so that then we can just keep doing the same things we're doing for over and over and over again. To show you how significant that is in 2022 in terms of total waste managed, you're talking about methylene chloride being number 2 overall of managed waste in the chemical industry, 300 billion pounds. 3 billion pounds, sorry, not 300 billion pounds. 3 billion pounds. That's still a lot. And so Biden said, you can't do that. Can you imagine how people reacted to being able to do that? And so let's talk about solvents for a little bit. So where this idea comes from. And so that's the question, do you need it at all? Is this something that you actually need? Most chemists would say absolutely, that we've been doing this forever. Well, where does the idea come from? The idea actually comes from Aristotle. Aristotle pontificated about a lot of things. I mean, the first scientists were philosophers. And so there are observations that one makes, and then you just make connections, right? So this one connection is, wait a second. Water seems to come together, and 2 solid particles don't seem to come together. And so clearly this liquid thing must be necessary in order for stuff to come together. See the same thing in food, right? So if you dry out the food, no chemical reactions go through. If you keep the food wet, chemical reactions go. So this idea of must be a necessity for chemistry to happen just continues on. Well, so that was the idea. So then you might say, well, someone could kind of think about this differently and so on and so forth. Well, St. Thomas Aquinas kind of fell in love with Aristotle's teaching, and then it became kind of like, well, going against Aristotle is kind of like going against the church. And at that period of time, you probably didn't want to go against the church. And so we had some challenges there, and so we kind of left it alone as it related to that. So then alchemy comes in, and so you get some other rules about what's going on. And so people started looking for the universal solvent because it's so important. And then you start other people giving rules to it. And so they say, well, I've noticed these things, that you need this liquid for this to happen, and so on and so forth. Then you get to the 1960s, and you're like choosing the right solvent. So not just any solvent, you got to pick the right one. So even if it has environmental issues, because this is around the same time that the Rachel Carson is, well, if you want it to work, you got to do this, and so on and so forth. So then that became the thing. But then there were people in the 80s in Japan that didn't have access to certain things. Says, this is actually working without the solvent, so do we actually need it? So then maybe that's not needed as much. And then you had other people come back, no, you totally need that. See, you're wrong, because we've been doing it this way for this long. This is what actually needs to happen. This is what you need. And so then you had all of these different people going back and forth about whether you need it or not. And so this is where I started my career going in, is where is this? What does this work, and does this not work, and what do we need? So if you want a reaction to occur, molecules need to bump into each other. And so what other people discovered, and what we kind of worked in on, is, maybe you don't need the liquid. You just got to do it differently. And so traditionally, these are some of the things you've probably seen. If you take 2 things, you put it into a flask, you add the solvent. What the solvent does is mix things together, and you heat it up, and then you remove the liquid. That's the waste piece, and so on and so forth. But this is what you actually wanted. What you can do instead is, instead of just doing it this way, you can dump it into a vial, put a ball bearing inside, put it into what it looks like a paint shaker. It just oscillates back and forth really, really fast. The ball bearings interact through everything, and then you could get what you wanted, but you didn't have anything to throw out. So why don't we do that instead and see if that works? And so I'm going to skip this piece because it doesn't matter, but this is the equipment that we use. And so these are various different vials that we do in the chemistry that goes on, and I hope this video plays. Let's see. Great. So this is a picture of the vial going back and forth, and there's a ball bearing on the inside. And that's basically what looks like slowed down. So basically, you would have material inside the vial. The ball is crushing the material, mixing it together, and a chemical reaction is happening while that's going on. And then when you're done, you just take the ball out, you take the chemicals out, and then you have whatever you had before without the liquid, without the waste, without anything else. And so that's the process that we go through. And we do it for a whole host of different things. And we're also able to scale it up into a larger scale. And so people says, well, how do you make it industrial? There's something called a twin screw extruder. When you have this extruder, you basically can take what you learned in the small reaction vessel and put it in this extruder. And it's basically screws coming out. So screws kind of meld the thing together, and then it just comes out of the barrel. And so we work with some pharmaceutical companies to develop processes and procedures for them doing things that way. And so it works out pretty well. So this is, how well it works in terms of temperature and time. And so we can get pretty much the quantitative conversion of various different things. There's some interesting things you have to do with screw elements and things of that sort that I'm not going to really get into. But you can do a lot of different things with it. And so this is just an example of, this is the older process to make this thing called dantrolene. And this is the short one-step extrusion, no base, no solvent, to get to the same thing in a short amount of time. So you could do it very quickly. It's very continuous. And these are all the environmental benefits of doing it this way versus the other. And so if you look at all the waste that you have to do in this process with emissions and solvents, so on and so forth, these cut that down significantly in this process versus the other process. And there's a lot of other ways to do this in terms of what the cost implications would be, what the waste implications would be, something called process mass index, how much waste per chemical product that you're making in it. And so basically, if you use this methodology, it's very clear in terms of economically, energy, steps, waste. I mean, it outperforms what we're currently doing significantly in a lot of different ways. And we could do this on a number of different fronts. These are some other aspects of it. But really, there's a high advantage. And so one of the things you might ask is, then why aren't we doing it? It goes back to the first thing I say. I don't want to change. If I've been doing something a long period of time, I want to keep doing it. I want to keep doing it. And that's where regulations, that's where you come into play. It says, no, I demand that we have a better outcome in terms of what we're doing. So the last thing I will say, actually two last things I'll say. These are the people that actually do the work. I just get to talk to you, but there's some people actually that do a lot of this work, and that's those individuals. And the University of Cincinnati is working alongside a lot of other institutions to try to help understand this. In the Center for Mechanochemical Control of Chemistry, the government sees the potential of this in terms of environment and so on and so forth. And they force all of us to work together, which is an interesting thing in and of itself. All different cultures, you can see the different schools and organizations there, to work together to try to commercialize this, get it out there to other people, and so on and so forth. And with that, I really thank you for spending the time listening to me and your attention. Jen, thank you for the invitation. Angela, thank you for bringing this to my attention. Happy to answer any questions you might have. Yeah.
So, are there boundaries or limits to applying the mechanical substitution for solvents?
So the question is, are there boundaries and limits to applying mechanochemistry to other chemical reactions? At this moment, the answer is yes. So I'll give you some of the aspects of some of the boundaries. Some of the boundaries right now is there are some reactions that we currently have going on where we do things, let's say, stepwise, meaning, okay, step one happens here, and then you have to take that out, and then step two happens there. You can imagine if something's moving really, really fast, how are you going to add another step into it if it's going really, really fast? I'm saying it's a challenge right now because it was a challenge in chemistry a long time ago. So before the round bottom flask, I talk about alchemy in 1600, they didn't have any of the tools that we're using today to do the chemistry. And so what we need are people who are equally invested, engineers and others, to say, okay, I see your problem. Here's a tool that you could utilize to overcome that challenge. And so that is what this center is designed to do. There's something called an integrated tool set. So we have mechanical engineers in the center, and they are invested in saying, okay, what is your problem? I'll build a tool, hopefully, to help you overcome it. I do believe in the next 20, 30 years or so, those problems will be alleviated. I think there was a question over here. Yes.
I had a question about like scale, and if you're dealing with a commodity product that's made, on a huge scale versus, a smaller batch product. I'm just wondering, as far as like economies of scale, and does it really pay to make it mechanochemically versus
The traditional. So the question is scale, and how does this scale, and what incentives would a company have to switch over their process to this scale? And so scale-wise is doable. So this twin screw extruder process, extruders happen anyway, which is why this process is there. A lot of it happens in the plastics material. So they have these huge extruders. So there was something in there called space-time yield, is how much material you could get out of a period of time. And you want it to be continuous because a plant wants to run 24 hours a day. And so I didn't show a picture of it, but you feed material in, it goes through the extruder, and it just comes out. And so it can scale significantly through. The big challenge is if I'm a company, how important is it for me to manage how much waste is being generated out versus me switching my plant over? So an economist is going to look at that. That is where laws come in. And so if I go through and I say I'm going to increase the waste cost that you have, now that becomes a part of the cost of doing business and so on and so forth, and is another aspect. And so that's why a lot of companies are reaching out. Internally, though, they're asking the scientists of, hey, what do you think about this mechanochemistry thing? I don't want to do it. Okay, so now it's a situation of, if I try it and it works, now I've got to switch things over. But what if I don't want to because I feel like I got to learn something different? I might not be in the same spot. I know this process. I'm the manager and so on and so forth. I think generations will come behind where a younger person will come in, and that's a lot of people coming through is saying, I got to fix this problem. I am not married to the way the company did it before I got here, so let's figure out a different way. But the tools exist to be able to scale it to whatever you need to do. I think there's one in the back and then one here.
So what, wow. What process or industry is not using green energy that you would like to see, and I mean the scale at which it would help?
So I think most big companies are, because they are highly regulated and there's a lot of things. So if you're thinking about a Pfizer or a Merck or so on and so forth, underneath that are the smaller ones. And so they are outsourced to a smaller company to do things. And that smaller company is not incentivized because they don't have as much capital to switch over things. They might get, so if I'm a new pharmaceutical company, or if I'm a new company that's doing chemistry, and let's say a Merck or a Pfizer decided I'm going to switch over to a greener process, so I don't need these tools anymore. The first thing they're going to do is, well, I'm going to buy your tool because it's cheaper for me to buy your used tool so I can implement that going through. If we could set regulations on those industries, because there's more of them, even though they're not as big, that would also have a significant impact on the amount of waste and things that are generated. There was a question right in front of me.
I think about capital I mean, that is so expensive to change over, especially if you have giant plants. I work for P&G. I work with toothpaste. Like, they're giant just vats of where this is all made. And I'm just trying to think of where something like this could be applied. And I'm just thinking of the changeover in teaching people. And I think that is like the biggest challenge I feel like you guys are running into. It's not only we don't want to, it's have you seen the cost that's going to be?
So you're right. So that comes through, which is why I used the Europe example. So Procter & Gamble has processes in the United States of America, and they have processes overseas. And they operate differently because the rules are different. So you have to go through and say, okay, I don't have a choice in Europe because I have to address this problem. And so they're utilizing it to go over. So I would say a lot of my interactions are with European companies because they don't have a choice. I think the United States is going to get to that part, and they're going to get there where we don't have a choice either. The dividends that come back from those companies after they made the switch say, hey, wait a second, we're able to do a lot more in a long run. So if you do a long run calculation, it's going to be easier for you. So methylene chloride is gone, right? So now you're scrambling trying to figure out, okay, what do I do, what do I do, what do I do? And now you're going to try to figure out a substitute. And you're going to try, but chloroform is gone, which is another chlorinated hydrocarbon. And people are scrambling, right? You're going to try to figure things out. Ultimately, if you get away from it completely, now you got a solution that's going to last you for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And I think Europe is seeing that because they had their thing for REACH eliminated a long time ago. So we're just behind Europe, and I think we're going to have to catch up. But no one's forcing us to do it at the moment, which is why we have the politics that we have. They got a Green Party. We're working our way towards a Green Party. And so I think we'll get there ultimately, but you're right. If I don't have to do it, then I'm not going to. But the regulations are going to pass at some point. I think there was a question over here or over there.
I have a question. Oh, sorry. So the issue becomes one of selectivity. So if you are mixing two chemicals together, whether mechanically or chemically or whatever, and getting a reaction, you're not going to get 100%. So if it's solvent-based, water-based, whatever, you can do things that enable you to filter out what it is that you want and ignore the stuff you don't want. If you have a pile of dry material, how are you going to separate it?
So from a separation standpoint, you could separate the same ways you normally do. So typically, the difference is, I'll give you an example of a company that we work through. In the reaction standpoint, the two things have to mix together really well. Both compounds have to mix really well in the solvent to do the mixing, so on and so forth. So you have very limited choices in terms of what you're able to do. That's fixed. On the separation side, you do have choice in terms of what you're able to do because you want to get rid of some things. So now you're not looking at dissolving everything. You may be looking at selectively dissolving, heating up, getting rid of one of the components, so on and so forth. So not all solvents are bad. So I talked about, okay, we drink ethanol. Water can be a solvent. Ethyl acetates, fingernail polish remover, so is acetone, so on and so forth. There are a list of solvents that you're able to use. The challenge is that those solvents typically don't dissolve all of the components that you want to use. And so this process allows you freedom and choice to say, okay, I don't have to worry about from a reaction standpoint. So what are the things that I need to do on the isolation standpoint that I need to kind of work through? And so now you have the ability to say, okay, this can go into the environment. This is not so bad. It's the volatile organic solvents that I have to really worry. It's the methylene chlorides I have to worry about, and so on and so forth. If you get rid of that, I don't have to run the reaction in that, but I can still do the workup or the isolation in something different, which they would have to do anyway, and that's what they do. They strip off the thing they don't want, and they typically have a greener process to do the isolation.
Aside from the waste problem, does the extrusion process require significantly more energy than the solvent process? And you're nodding yes already. So does that then...
I'm nodding yes, I understand the question.
But does that then enter into the cost-benefit analysis that these people are going through?
So actually, it's not more energy. It's actually less energy. So when you think about the process, if you think about a reaction vessel that you would have to do normally, you have to stir it around, so you have to spend energy agitating, and you have to heat it up to some degree. If you wanted to look at, okay, so I'm going to heat up, let's just imagine, I live in a very old home that has radiator heat, so hot water heat goes through. So it takes significant hours to heat up all the water, because water has a high heat capacity, and there's a lot of mass that I have to heat up that if I didn't have to heat that all up, then I wouldn't need it. If I didn't have the mass, most of the mass is the liquid. So if I have to heat something up and I don't have the liquid to heat up, even if I'm heating it to the same spot, now I use less energy because I have less mass that I have to heat up to the same spot. I really want the molecules being heated up to 100 degrees. I don't need all the liquid heating up. But if my liquid represents 75 or 80% of the process, that is what I'm spending most of my energy doing, not the other way. Oh, another question.
Well, so then you're actually saying that it can be an energy benefit. That can be an additional benefit.
No question.
Actually.
And so one of the slides that was on there, they did the calculation of cost, energy, waste. There's a laundry list of doing it this way to be able to save on all of these process to process. So if you go into a company and say, tell me your process. Okay, I'm going to do this for you. I'll save you on this thing, this thing, this thing, this thing, this thing. So all of those check boxes are there, which is why the National Science Foundation said this is something we got to move into.
Oh, and one more thing. What was the insecticide that was put down on the fire ants?
I can't remember the name of it, but it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, probably
and the
not.
company was really upset at Rachel Carson because they got defunct and so on and so forth. But a lot of this is, in terms of some of the things that we all are talking about, is, are we making a 5-minute decision? So are we making a decision for the next 5 minutes, right? So that my next quarter, I'm going to have this profit, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Are we making a decision for the next 5 decades? And that is really how we have to try to figure out what decision we're going to make. Because ultimately, we're going to pass this problem down to the next generation. And they're going to have limited options in terms of how to solve that problem. And the next generation is going to have limited options on how to solve that problem. And so do we want to be proactive or reactive is really the conversation that we're having. If you think about Congress and you think about laws, if I'm in Congress and I'm of a certain age group, am I really thinking about 50 years from now? And I think some people, yes, I'm thinking about 50 years from now. I think some people think about the next election. That's probably 2 years from now. And so I don't know what the right answer is, but we have to figure out how we want to make these decisions.
Those were great questions. Thank you, everyone.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
I appreciate that. As a quiet woman making a lot of change, I appreciate the framing. I'm also disappointed there's not a murder hornet video out. So as I mentioned, we do this monthly. We're normally on the first Wednesday of the month. In the new year in January, we'll actually be on Wednesday, January 15th. So enjoy the holidays, and we'll come back and talk about science. You can follow us on Facebook or Meetup. I'm looking to expand our communication channels as people are leaving certain platforms. And all of our videos all our events are recorded on Radio Artifacts YouTube channel if you want to go out and see previous events. So thank you all for coming.